In a war of attrition, material counts, and the largest arms maker in the world, OEWG, well, its stock room would be emptied for the effort, including contract overruns from South America. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the rifle model 1912, an export Mauser, and in this case I'm holding the Chilean version, but there are several others. Let's go ahead and get this over the light box. At 49.2 inches in length and weighing 8.8 pounds, this is again another very standard looking Mauser export rifle, as a 5-round magazine, flush fit, stripper clip fed, feeding that excellent 7x57mm cartridge. Hello again, my old friends. We are finally at the tail end of our Great War Mauser saga. We saw the 7180, 7184, 1887, all of these serving as rear line reserve arms with various nations during the war, and the 89 and 90, 1893 and 1899, and the Pinnacle, the 1898, in both domestic and export flavors. These guns were all frontline acceptable in a variety of cartridges. Well, as you're starting to see, the Mauser family of firearms is a big deal, one that by World War I ended in the 1898 long rifle, and if I'm being honest, we're now on the 6th episode about this action. Today, we're talking about the model 1912, which is in no way significantly distinct from the export 1907 we've seen before, but for what it lacks in mechanical changes, it does reveal a wealth of historical information worth knowing. Truly unique for this show, that history is found in South America. At this point in history, South America was poised to be the next great industrial market. Economic potential was everywhere. The nations were all growing, nationalizing, and setting their borders, forming alliances and clashing with opponents. And for arms makers, war was always just around the corner. Thankfully, our story mostly centers on one country, so I only have to burden you with so much regional politics. And really, it all begins with the War of the Pacific. This conflict between Chile and a Bolivian-Peruvian alliance lasted from 1879 to 1884 and was fought over coastal land in the Atacama Desert. The end result was a Chilean victory. Having secured more ports, more resource-rich lands, and having landlocked Bolivia, Chile was in a much better position to keep going forward. But that also obviously left its neighbors pretty TO'd. This tension carried on into the early 1900s as the landlocked Bolivia negotiated with Chile for rail access to the sea. Once secured, this largely pacified the Bolivian issue, but Peru, they also lost valuable territory in the conflict. Much of it was decided in the treaty that had ended the war, but the provinces of Tacna and Arica were not hard negotiated. Instead, they were left to an 1893 plebiscite, which was never held due to political squabbling. And so in 1909, Chile unilaterally decided to start colonizing both, and Peru would protest and then break diplomatic relations in 1911. This obviously caused rising tensions and could have broken into another war. And so Chile thought, better to be prepared just in case. Presently, they were armed with the Mauser 1895 as produced by Ludwig Olson in Germany, later renamed DWM, don't get confused on this point. Throughout the intervening years, just like we saw in the Ottoman Empire, Chile, and honestly much of South America, was being enlisted in the German school of warfare. This is often talked about as a means of modernizing warfare, generally associated with emergent smaller nations or older empires in need of reform. Basically, Germany would happily ship out martial advisors around the world who would give you good old advice on training military personnel, particularly officers, using equipment, that sort of thing. This bred a certain loyalty, and when it came time to purchase armament, be it small arms or artillery, they would naturally turn to German industry. You can see more of that sort of thing in our Ottoman 1887 episode, a gun that exists almost exclusively because of German influence. In Chile, unlike the old empire, armament contracts were less about personal favors and more a mix of bribes and public opinion. Krupp Steel had already ousted the French firm Schneider Cruzat using an effective defamation campaign. In the arms department, there were only two real competitors to DWM on the world stage. The Belgian firm Fabrique Nationale was already under their control, so DWM just simply ordered them to stand down. And then the only real problem left would be OEWG in Austria, the largest arms maker in the world, wasn't going to be pushed out easily. And as a German-speaking, ethnically German, country with extremely close personal allegiances to Germany, this usually ruthless tactic of, slander and alignment would have to be dialed down at least a little bit on DWM's part. So much so that sometime around 1904 and 1905, DWM and OEWG had managed a conversation on the matter. Essentially, they decided on regional monopolies, at first limited to Russia, Japan, China, and Ethiopia. I'm entirely unsure who got which region in this negotiation, though I strongly suspect DWM did get China in that deal. In 1907, the agreement was expanded. DWM locked off Germany and the Ottoman Empire and Spain. Its subsidiary company, Fabrique Nationale, kept its native Belgium and the Congo. OEWG laid down claim to its native Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. Latin America, however, that was fair game. Sorta. In order to deal with the market still up for grabs, both companies agreed to some good old-fashioned price fixing. Any and all long rifles had to start at 75 Swiss gold franc, and whoever won the contract had to pay a set fee into a common fund that would be split by the remainers. I've heard it was 15 franc, but I can't be sure. I know this seems entirely unethical, but given some of the usual political backstabbing, bribery, fear tactics, this is downright civil. Let's see how long it holds. So in 1910, Chile is colonizing a pair of provinces no one is sure who technically owns, and Peru is getting pretty mad about this. So it's probably time to prepare for a war, and wisely Chile started with the easy stuff, spare parts. 20,000 rifle and 6,000 carbine barrels were immediately contracted for with OEWG, a happy victory for the Austrian firm. From there, Chile sought to buy 20,000 stocks, 30,000 rear sights to adapt their rifles to Spitzer bullets, an unknown number of spare bolts, firing pins, and receivers. Later, 46,000 rifle and 12,000 carbine barrels were suggested as well, and so on and so forth. Basically, a lot of parts. But after the initial OEWG order, Chilean officials began to comparison shop DWM and OEWG, which triggered more than a fair bit of competition. OEWG not only beat out DWM on the price, but also was able to provide updated ladder sights, which DWM scoffed at and sought to provide only, tangent sights like we've become used to. So again, the Austrians took the ball, and DWM began to worry because spare parts weren't the only thing at stake. Chile would need more. Specifically, they would need more firearms, 30,000 brand new rifles and 4,000 carbines, along with 30 million more cartridges. These being, again, 7x57mm. They had followed the Spanish lead and adopted this excellent cartridge back in their 1895 Mausers, although it was now making the upgrade to a Spitzer bullet. The Austrian firm Keller & Co. took the ammunition contract, and while the Weapons Commission were already in the area, they reached out to OEWG about their rifle problem, who happily agreed to produce them at a reasonable cost. So all is well, and the story feels pretty standard up until this point, which is when DWM decided enough was enough and got involved. Using their local officials and media contacts, they began a firestorm. Since OEWG had not been the original producer of the Chilean Mausers, there was some fear that the parts measurements were gonna not align, and soon concerns came forward from the arsenal staff, who said that the OEWG parts were not a correct fit on the original DWM guns. Now, OEWG had been extremely precise, working off the original measurements, jigs, and instruments, but when the first parts came over and were tested, the pro-DWM camp got some backing. Most notable was Inspector General Jorge Bunen Rivera, who immediately leapt to attack officers, politicians, and OEWG for wasting funds on bad parts, which in turn jeopardized the security of Chile right at a moment of crisis. He was overzealous on this matter and very public. This sentiment, combined with incentivized news articles led to a firestorm against OEWG and a panic to secure more modern arms. In response to the controversy, the Chilean government dissolved the Weapons Commission in 1911 and reformed it outside the oversight of the embassy, which it had previously operated under. And then again, they sort of rebuilt the whole thing again, this time with ambassadorial support. It's a mess. DWM was now petitioned to produce the rifle and carbine contract though, and the 30 million rounds of ammunition. They replied suspiciously quick with their rate and were just about given the contract, which is when DWM realized their mistake. Brazil had ordered 100,000 more Model 1908 rifles, and now they didn't have the capacity to take on the Chilean order. So after all that, they would actually have to defer to OEWG. The Chilean officials were not too happy about that fact and said, you either take the whole order for rifles and everything, or you don't get the ammunition order. While all this was happening, under a special commission, OEWG was cleared of all charges of poor parts manufacture. There were a lot of little incremental problems that were highlighted, but really it came down to two big things. First, the mixing of old and new parts meant that worn, stretched receivers or barrels being fitted with factory fresh replacement parts, well, they weren't going to line up, and OEWG couldn't be expected to predict the individual wear or distortion of each original part. Second, the initial research was conducted with make-do whipped-up smokeless powder, which was suggested by two former DWM employees who were currently working in Chile. With DWM exposed, OEWG threatened to leave the cartel agreement, and that means that they would begin openly competing and undercutting them for price across the globe. With that threat, OEWG, DWM, and the Chilean officials, well, they sat down for negotiation. DWM in particular had already locked down the really big contracts in Brazil and Argentina and sold some to Peru, so they would not be too heartbroken to make way for OEWG this time, and of course, they got to keep their partial kickback from each order. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the rifle came to finally be ordered out of OEWG. After all that mess, it just ended up where it started and under the same agreement. The cost, well, of course, it was 75 francs, so the only loser here is Chile. Since the contract was set for 1912, that is the name associated with this particular batch of Mausers, so let's get a closer look. Alright gang, I don't think you are going to be surprised. Metal, butt plate, semi-pistol grip stock, moving into a Mauser 98 action, flag safety, cock on open, you get all that. What is different, and I want to point out here, is that these guns usually have a quick detach sling point here, or on occasion you'll find them with a standard wired sling a little bit further forward like this one is. Those are shallower fit, and I'll tell you about that more a little bit further in the episode. It's kind of critical. As we go forward, we are going to see something kind of unique, which is that our receiver is in the white. So let me get a little closer. Look at that brilliant white, as in unblued, raw, polished metal. Look at that beautiful crest. That is fantastic. And then we're going to move further down the rifle. So coming on in, we've got a rear sight, more on that in a second. And we'll come on forward. Again, wrap around handguard, halfway point, middle band, walking forward to a, hey, we are up to an H-lug bayonet style with that deep 98 lug. This is probably the strongest bayonet style that we could go with. This is excellent. Front sight, all that good stuff coming on back. God, it's long. We do have a reinforcing lug, which is interesting. I'm not sure if this was added because of problems with 7mm operating, or if it was because they just overbuilt the system in order to make it sort of more universal. Or maybe it's a Spitzer reaction. There's a lot of questions as to why specifically this shows up now, but not on the previous guns, especially since they were all in reasonably similar powered cartridges. But regardless, it is right there. And honestly, it makes the gun stronger overall. If you're curious about what these do, by the way, I don't think I've ever really explained it. This is attached to a metal bar that sets up against part of the receiver and then beds it down in the wood in such a way as to distribute the load more evenly into the wood in such a way that it does not deform the wood and eventually compress it and have the action rattling around in there, which will then drive splitting. Usually if you get that splitting, it will, clunk, will usually show up. Actually, let me get this in the other camera. That splitting would usually turn up back here, because what would happen is without the reinforcing lug, this becomes a wedge that starts splitting the back of the stock. So if you don't have a recent reinforcing lug or yours is worn out, you'll start to see cracking back here as a result. All right, so The one thing I want to point out about this rear sight on this gun is it's the great disappointment of this rifle, in my eyes, because it is a great tangent rear leaf, very shallow because it's definitely for Spitzer cartridge from the outset. And then if I go to adjust it, I'm gonna put, okay, hold on, I'm gonna push on that. Okay, I'll push both. We'll get started with both. Then I'm gonna put, I don't know what happened somewhere in the process, but we are back to pushing both buttons before we can adjust the sight at all. I guess because of flatter shooting, they weren't worried about sight adjustment as incremental anymore, but I can no longer just walk that sight up. I consider that to be a negative, honestly, compared to what we've seen on the previous 1907 pattern, but I suppose it's a small negative. It just means a little more fiddling. I can't have everything in one package, I suppose. But overall, a beautiful, beautiful military Mauser. Now, of course, this gun is not unique enough mechanically from our earlier Gewehr 98 episode to warrant an animation, so we can go straight to shooting it. Well, one that looks very similar to it. We'll find out more on why they are slightly different a little bit later. Now, that range gun doesn't look quite like this one here, and there's a good reason, but we're not done with our history lesson yet, so that's why you're confused. In the end, 37,500 rifles and 5,600 carbines would be produced for Chile in 1912 by OEWG. Reasonably, these should have been delivered before 1914, but we'll see why that's curious in a bit. Chile would not be the only purchaser of the model 1912. Once in production, it proved a tantalizing offer for two other countries. That's going to be Mexico and Colombia. The former had tried their hand at domestic production back in 1910. They had switched from their 1893 pattern guns to the 98 pattern with the model 1902, produced by both DWM and OEWG some years prior. In 1910, they attempted their own production of this rifle pattern, but, and you might not know this, the Mexican Revolution did indeed happen in Mexico, making domestic manufacture untenable. So they rushed an order of model 1912s from OEWG, 100,000 to be exact, at a price of 84 francs apiece, so that's a bit of a hike. The contract was signed in July of 1912 with a 40% down payment. But the revolution halted any further monies, and so only 33,000 rifles were delivered. The remaining 67,000 or so were stored over at OEWG awaiting funds. While I don't have a Mexican model 1912 on hand, it's identical to this gun, except for the crest. Yep, that's Mexico all right. And while we're at it, this is the Colombian. Again, the same rifle overall, except for the marking, although, like Chile, they had a carbine as well. Roughly 25,000 rifles and carbines combined would be ordered. They also bought up a handful of Schwarzlose machine guns. Unfortunately for Colombia, who did intend to pay their entire bill and receive all their rifles, by the time the final lot was due for delivery, war were declared. And with that, only 18,500 or so were received. With the start of the Great War, the Austro-Hungarian War Office ordered no more exports, and the arms presently on hand were bought up for reserve use. In this case, a pile of Mauser model 1912s, all in 7mm, were in excellent reserve weapon. So let's take a look at the board. Roughly 5,000 were left over from Colombia and nearly 67,000 from Mexico, but Chile, that's where it gets weird. I've seen it written that 37,500 rifles and 5,600 carbines were seized, but those are exactly the same numbers I've seen for confirmed production in 1912. Did the original 1912 contract get fully completed? Was there another unfinished contract I have not heard of? Were there very few Chileans left over from failed inspections? That one's kind of weird too, because the serial blocks can be all over the place from the handful that I've seen that actually were used by Austria-Hungary. Honestly, it's a mystery to me, and I do not have what I would call a reliable answer, and so I'm not going to pass that on. However, whatever the total is, those guns were purchased by the government for 84 kroner a pop and designated collectively as the Model 14. And there were some changes made. The original contract long rifles all had receivers in the white, but the Austrian guns, well, they looked a little bit more like this one right here. Not exactly, but a little bit more. So let's get a little closer look at this guy. The major difference of an Austrian gun is going to be that the receiver is blued. I do not suspect, sadly, that this gun is actually blued. I think this is just browned its way here over years of handling. So I do not believe this to be an Austrian service rifle. However, it does have something that can show you approximately what you need to look for to be sure. At the rear, instead of the quick detach or anything else, and tucked up right against the wrist, we have a sling loop. Let me get that from above too. And right there. That sling loop, see that guy? It's pretty critical. If we zoom in on him, this plain wire sling loop, and don't get too excited yet because it does appear on a lot of Chilean guns and other 1912s in addition to the quick detaches. If you have one of these that is bigger than this one, very broad and even wider, sticking awkwardly off the side of the stock, that sling loop is designed for Mannlicher style, Mannlicher 1895 style slings. As a matter of fact, if you have a Mannlicher 1895, you can hold up its sling loop and see exactly what size they should be. Unfortunately, again, this is not technically a 1914, but it's going to shoot exactly the same cartridge and everything else. I think it's perfectly adequate for what we're doing today. These guns obviously saw limited service compared to the standard infantry rifle, as production was not continued and OEWG turned to making more Mannlicher 1895, so straight pull end block gun that we've covered long ago. Still, I have found plenty of photos of these 7mm Mausers in the hands of Austrian troops, and while I cannot find any mention of personal preference, I imagine the rifle and cartridge would be a match or frankly better than the standard issue. Given the gentle curve of the magazines of several Austrian Madsens I've seen, I suspect they were also fielded in the 7x57mm cartridge, which was put into production domestically for the war. I have also found images of a 1912 being used as a test bed for an Austro-Hungarian prototype scoped rifle project, so I'm sure they were held in some regard for precision, accuracy, and handling. Now, the dual monarchy really was the premier user of these rifles for the war, and if not for their significant role there, I might not have mentioned them because the handful that the British used, well, that barely counts. Interestingly, Britain had already produced 7mm Mauser ammunition for domestic production back in 1903. It was needed to arm the machine guns aboard their new Swiftshore class ships. Named for the HMS Swiftshore and its sister the Triumph, these were both Chilean ships under construction just before the Russo-Japanese War. Thanks to treaties at home limiting naval power, the Chileans sought to sell both, and when the Russians outbid Japan on the matter, Britain stepped in and bought the pair instead. This situation would repeat itself on the eve of World War I, with British shipbuilders working on two 28,000-ton battleships, again for Chile, along with several 1,500-ton destroyers. Many of these ships were nearly complete and already outfitted with ammunition and rifles, in need of whatever they could get, though the sale to Chile was halted by the British. With both ships bought up, they would change names over to the HMS Canada, which managed to join the fleet for the war, and the HMS Eagle, which couldn't make up its mind what it wanted to be when it grew up. The ships, though, they're not our main interest. Rather, roughly 800 Chilean Model 1912 rifles and apparently carbines were soaked up into British naval service. There, they served alongside the Ross and other reserves used for drill, minesweeping, guard duty, and defensively armed merchant ships. Additional small numbers of auxiliary rifles came from another South American country, Brazil. The massive battleship Rio de Janeiro was launched in January of 1913 but proved too expensive to keep and was offered up for sale in May. The Ottoman government would bite in December and renamed it the Sultan Osman I, leaving it with Armstrongs in Britain for a lavish refit. It should have been delivered in July, but the British stalled its release, seeing war on the horizon. First, Sea Lord Winston Churchill penned out an order that foreign powers should not be provided British-built ships in the current political circumstances, and the very next morning armed British troops boarded the ship and escorted off the Turkish officials overseeing the final touches. This was done just 24 hours before it was due to be delivered to the Ottomans. Because the ship was actually funded by a large public drive, the seizure didn't just upset Ottoman officials, but also the people themselves. It was deeply insulting and is often quoted as the final wedge in relations between those two powers. Anyway, the Brazilians back at the beginning of this didn't remove their Mauser 1908 rifles, and so some few hundred ended up in British service as well. Like the Chileans, they used 7mm ammunition, which was produced at home in handy packages, conveniently marked by the British 7mm Chilean. Whew, alright guys, that is a long history of export Mausers, but we're at the tail end of it. This ultimately being the final, the 1912, which was produced right before the war, and is honestly extremely robust, and in my mind, everything the 98 should have been at the time of adoption. But we're gonna have to get Mae's opinion on this one to be absolutely sure, so let's find out. Alright gang, we've made room for Mae, and yes, this is another long export Mauser, and there's been a bunch of these little episodes together. However, one day, you'll miss it, trust me. Everybody raised a fit about the 32s, and now guess what's in my inbox all the time? When are you gonna do another 32 episode? Well, You guys wait, it's gonna be 32-2 Electric Boogaloo soon enough.
So wait, are we going to be the all Mauser channel or the all 32 channel?
It depends on the week. I'm sorry guys, but it really helps for me to be able to research within a narrow band and not lose my mind. So we talked about the Mausers together because it made it the easiest to research and the easiest to present. And you're finally at the end of it, and I'll bring you something wacky next time. But when we're done apologizing, let's talk about something that's really actually very cool. And again, it's another one of those instances where we have a gun that is so familiar that we forget how important it is. We have the Chilean 1912s in our hands, also known as the Colombian 12s and the Mexican 12s. There's a handful of people that bought 12s. And even if they didn't buy 12s, a lot of people bought guns like the Brazilian 1908 that are just like these. They just have various numbers on them. But we're talking about what in terms of ergonomics at this point?
All right, guys, just for a quick review. She's long, heavy, balance is still decent, semi-pistol grip, medium range comb height, not too bad. We've got the Gewehr 98 action, nothing different there. Two-stage trigger. A lot of this is similar. Oh, hey, we've got that nice H-band up here. So up here with the bayonet lug. So everything's nice and tight and solid up here, which is great. And then, yeah, I guess we got the same rear. Well, wait a minute. This doesn't adjust incrementally.
You have to hit both buttons every time.
No!
They got rid of the best feature.
Monsters.
They probably saved a penny. Actually, back then it was probably a quarter of a penny.
It might have been. That's actually a lot back then.
I can't find any notes as to why they got rid of that, but no.
Maybe it wasn't actually being used.
Oh, so the back when we did the Gewehr 98 episode with the longer vizier, I had people writing me left and right being like, my gun doesn't do that. And it's just like, well, it didn't stick around. So there's only a handful of tangent rear sight Mausers that have the ability to alternating click. So now some of you can feel special and some of you can feel disappointed and never know the joy of, incremental sight adjustments.
Broken. They could have it. It could just be broken.
Yeah. No, you have to hit both buttons in order to adjust these.
I know. I'm sorry.
I tried it on both too. I got really worried.
You had a dream and now it's gone.
I mean, I can just take this off and solder on. No, that's not gonna.
No.
Okay, well, rear sight is obviously disqualified this gun from military service, but let's keep on going. Ergonomics are the same. The only thing that's really going to stand out from the last couple episodes is despite still being chambered in 7mm Mauser, these have the reinforcing lug in the stock. Right up under your pinky there.
Yeah.
But that affects nothing for the shooter.
Honestly, I didn't notice much of a difference.
I mean, it's another spot for gunk to get into when you're a collector and you're trying to clean all the rust back out of it.
So it's annoying for you, and then I don't have to care.
Just hose WD-40 down in there because
stop telling people that. Even as a joke, people do it because they're dumb.
WD-40 is the devil. All right, so ergonomically, there's no real difference from our previous episodes, and it's the same cartridge, so I think we know how this is going to shoot, don't we?
Yeah, there's no real big surprises there, unfortunately. It's just not that much. There's really not much of a difference, even though the weight was pretty similar just in the gun itself. So
the only reason for this really, this episode, is to tell the story of the Chilean Mausers, because it's absolutely fascinating.
Right.
There's cartels, and there's political pressure, and there's all this other stuff. And they've already heard it all by the time we're talking about this. So the only question for this gun that we could reasonably ask is compared to the 1907, because other than the bayonet lug and the incremental adjustment of the rear sight, like the lack of having that one button press, that's it.
Safety's the same, everything else is the same.
So I guess the question becomes kind of twofold. One, a German issued... actually, there's a couple questions we could ask. Let's do this. Let's go down the line this way, because I can think of a way to make this more interesting. Number one,
of course he does.
Between that gun and the Austrian standard issue Mannlicher 1895 straight pull.
Yeah, no, I don't know why I would pick that. That had an in-block feeding and a hole at the bottom that would poop out the little clip. I mean, no, that was weird. Well,
weird's not a problem. End blocks load faster than stripper clips, and you can't convince me otherwise.
This is true, but then you got to worry about preserving the end block itself, because then if that's not preserved, it's not going to feed properly, or it just will stay stuck in the gun. We've had that happen.
If you're carrying around the ammunition, the clip gets bent or damaged. When you load it in, the clip is now part of the feed lip system.
I think one of the worst ones we've seen is with the RSC. When that clip had any sort of dings into it, it just would not work.
Okay, so you don't trust end blocks, even though they load much faster.
I will agree. I will concede that point. They do load much faster. Just don't trust it.
All right, and then compared to the straight pull action, it's super fast, slick straight pull action when done exactly properly and not wartime manufacture.
I mean, yeah, then otherwise you're dealing with some stiff stuff there that you got to then kick open, hopefully.
So if you're an Austrian soldier who's issued this instead of the Mannlicher, you're happy?
Yes.
Okay, now we'll talk about comparison to the 1907, which is its nearest kissing cousin. Same cartridge, same weight, same length, different bayonet lug. But in German service, that was chambered in 7.92 and had the single button incremental adjustment. So which is better? This with the 2 buttons, but 7mm, or that 8mm single button?
I was honestly hoping he was going to forget about the fact that it was 8mm for the 1907. Because honestly, I've got the single adjustment for the sight, but I have lost the H-band on the 1907. And then I am dealing with 8mm Mauser. But you know what? Honestly, I think I'd still pick the 1907 because, weirdly, I'll be for it. I do like that incremental adjustment that you can do on the sight. I do think that's pretty great. And 8mm Mauser over 7mm short, it's still a decent cartridge. I'm not knocking that down, and that rifle's not going to get any shorter. It's going to stay as it is, so I may as well stick with the one that I like the best, that I felt the most proficient with.
I'm honestly torn. I'd probably go with the 12.
No, mister, I'm going to cry
only
if
get
you take
5
away my
rounds,
sight.
and then you got to...
He's been crying over this.
You have to stick somebody with the poker eventually, and I'll take the X. I don't know. The problem is I don't know how much extra reinforcement you're getting out of the H-band or not, but somehow I feel like having to more carefully walk this up on the few times I adjust it versus having a stronger bayonet lug and having a cartridge that I feel a little bit better about being flatter shooting and having to make fewer adjustments overall, I'll probably do that. So I'd go with the flatter cartridge. I'd go with the H-band.
Okay, fine. You've got your favorite. I've got mine. How about that?
Well, I think that wraps us up, though, because obviously these are exceptional for World War I.
Oh, yeah,
these are among the top rifles for World War I, except for their length.
I can see why Mauser's dreams were something that were going to definitely come true, because they are fantastic creations.
Now, do these make it in your top 5, though?
Ooh, that's getting up there, isn't it, boys and girls? Because it has been a while since we've done a review of this.
Yeah, but when we have an exceptional gun, we have to ask you, did it make the top 5? Did it make the top 10's getting hard to track because you have to keep so many models in your head.
Well, see, yeah, that's the problem is that I wish these were in carbine versions because that's the part that I think I keep getting hung up on is because I feel like when it becomes a carbine, it instantly goes up there because I'm able to just gain more mobility back with that. So I maybe wouldn't say the top 5, but I would say I think it might have made into the top 10.
Okay, and just to be clear, there is a carbine version of the 1912.
Hey.
It's just the Chilean contract theoretically had them. Were they in production and were they seized? I can't tell because a lot of the notes that we have around these being seized by Austria-Hungary are very unclear to me. And I can't say for sure that any or a significant number of carbines saw service. I haven't found any photo evidence of the carbines. All I see are these big old long rifles everywhere. And so they're exceptional long rifles, but I'm with Mae. They're still long rifles. And long rifles aren't our favorite thing. A universal short rifle was a very good idea going into World War I. Yes. And the universal short rifle guns tend to be the ones that sit near the top of our preferences. And if not, they're long rifles that have something unique like a rear aperture sight or things like that that really drive them home.
Right.
So still extremely good rifles.
Yes, that's why I'm thinking it might have squeaked its way into the top 10.
Okay, cool. Well, I think that's going to wrap us out. I know these seem plain, but that's because they are so good. You should take it that the fewer things we have to say, the better a rifle went. Other than that, have a good one.
Bye, guys.
Alright gang, just a quick reminder that we do have new product in the shop for your holiday enjoyment. Number one, we have the Russia t-shirt from our World Powers series. This thing is black with brilliant red screen printed ink, high quality. You guys know the drill. It's available over at C&Rsenal.com/shop. And along with that are our brand new patches. Now this first set is themed off of the trench gun, and if they sell well, we're going to start doing other patch theme sets for you to enjoy and remember things that you've learned on the show or just drive home some jokes that we all know. Now, again, the patches are new and we don't know how many of them you guys want. So even if this patch set isn't your ideal patch set, if you think that you like this general idea, they're very inexpensive. You may want to grab a pack just to send us the message of how many we should start to order of these things going forward, because this sale is what sets that sort of number that keeps us from overbuying or underbuying them as we go forward with the series. Again, if you want all of this before the holidays, you should probably get on it as soon as possible because we are running low already. And once they are out, yes, we can order more, but the turnaround will mean they won't be in time to put in anybody's stocking. So thank you for participating in that. In addition to that, of course, you can support us on Patreon. And if you do that, we do have a new ongoing hybrid podcast. It's an audio only program. I'm working on how to distribute it a little bit better at the moment, but it is available through a YouTube link to all patrons right now, in which Mae and I talk about what we've gone through for the past 2 weeks to get the show going. I've also tried to roll in different guests, so like Susie, who is rarely talkative about the show, has been on at least one, and I've got some buddies from other channels and things I'd like to roll into future ones. So if you'd like to hear more about what's going on behind the scenes, give that a try. Become a patron. It's available to everybody at any level of patronage. All right, have a good one.